The husband cried out that they too had experienced this in their childhood. At that time, the girl said that their son was traumatized not only physically but also psychologically. The man looked silently at his child, who was very scared. The man said they couldn't do anything about it because it was a tradition. At that time, Lloyd was on his way to the tent. He silently listened to what the Minotaurs were saying and then silently began to walk away. A little while later, the day began. All the Minotaurs began to gather and did not understand why they were gathered. At that time, Lloyd announced that a lecture on human speed was about to begin. The Minotaurs said that they thought Lloyd was not fast at all. They decided to pretend to listen and then leave immediately. Lloyd knew this would happen and asked that it was pointless to hear about speed from a man who was slow. Lloyd raised a finger up and then his tone and face changed. He said he didn't see the point in having fucking bastards like them. Everyone was incredibly angry, while Lloyd continued to talk about how the Minotaurs were inadequate and that there were a huge number of innocents suffering because of their runs. Lloyd talked about how yesterday he was forced to run, and as a result, one completely innocent child got hurt and suffered an injury that can't be treated. Lloyd talked about how it's always been that way. Because of some tradition, innocent people get hurt. The centaurs heckled Lloyd, saying that they had no claim, while the mother couldn't stand it and started yelling that she had a claim because her child was hurt because of all this. Lloyd listened to the voices of the Minotaurs shouting that the woman should be banished. Her husband couldn't stand it and called everyone a barbarian who didn't care about anyone else. Another woman started shouting that her child was hurt, and she hated these traditions as well. The child continued to shake in terror at the screams, but suddenly he calmed down for a moment, then looked at Lloyd's satisfied face and showed him he knew they had succeeded. Xavier was shocked at what he had just seen. It turned out in the past Lloyd had offered the kid money for his help, and it was all an elaborate act. Lloyd had just set in motion an irreversible process where the Minotaur society split. He felt like a puppeteer controlling these people. The people began to argue fiercely among themselves, shouting at each other with all their might, while the true puppeteer sat on his throne and looked down on the ruined people. A group of people who were conservative shouted with all their might that all traitors should be executed. But some of the people with new views shouted that they didn't want to live in such a tribe. While Lloyd stared blankly at the horror he himself had done, he didn't seem to care at all. The girl yelled at the guy. She couldn't understand why he had provoked it. Lloyd pretended he didn't care, explaining that he was just saying that the competition wasn't safe. The girl couldn't say anything back, just stunned by the hero's words. As Xavier thought about what Lloyd had done to cause this horror, he marveled at Lloyd's shamelessness. Suddenly, the voice of the village head was heard, asking why the place was so noisy. Lloyd seemed to be waiting for that, and then began to rise from his throne. The head of the village looked as stern as possible. At that time, Lloyd was thinking about what he was going to do next. The head talked about how Lloyd had promised to solve the tribe's speed problem, but in the end, he had made the tribe split into two sides that hated each other. Lloyd began to talk about how he was in the process of implementing this plan and how the villagers couldn't find a common ground and he was having a hard time with it. Lloyd talked about how one side wants to run anywhere at any time, while the other side wants to get rid of the tradition. Lloyd pretended as if he was thinking very intensely, then raised his finger up and began to say that to solve the problem, it would be enough to ban fast running and impromptu competitions in the village. The people shouted, expressing their displeasure that some man was daring to interfere with their rules. Lloyd did not listen to the lunatics, then extended another finger and began to talk about the second rule, namely that all matches will take place in a special stadium, which he can build. The head listened attentively to the hero's arguments why it was a good idea. After Lloyd began to talk about the fact that thanks to such a rule in the village may appear a genius who will be able to set a new speed record. The girl seemed to understand what Lloyd was getting at, while the head also looked at the boy, who always loses, even though he has great talent. Lloyd began to talk about how his decision would help him get rid of his injuries and also break the speed record that had stood still for so long. Eventually, Lloyd made a big face and then said that this was his brilliant plan to solve the problems. The people began to cheer. They were all in agreement with Lloyd's reasoning and plans. The mood of the population seemed to have changed completely, while the head of the village began to shout with all his might that this was nonsense. He began to say that they had survived only because they had the instinct to run, which could be activated in any situation. He also said that it was only because of this tradition that they had survived the Great War, and because of this he was not going to give it up so easily. Lloyd asked if they were living during the war now. The head began to say that it was a tribute to history and ancestors. The people tried to talk the ruler down, because Lloyd was actually saying smart and necessary things. The girl started to say that even if her father was against it, she would still allow the stadium to be built. The head started saying that it would split their tribe in two. The girl was not going to back down from her beliefs, while the people argued furiously among themselves. The head asked if Hiro was going to follow through, while Lloyd said that as soon as the head gave the go-ahead, he would get to work immediately. The head finally agreed. Although it may have seemed so at first glance, he had actually challenged Hiro to a competition, and if he lost, he would have to leave their village. Lloyd was overjoyed. He said that if he won, he wanted to build a stadium. The screams of a huge number of minotaurs could be heard outside. Lloyd had dressed up in sports clothes and was heading towards his opponent with the most serious look possible. Xavier didn't understand how Lloyd was going to win, since he had agreed not to use the blast, and he couldn't use his pets either. Lloyd confessed that he would run without the extra stuff. Xavier thought that Lloyd had no chance of winning, as the leader's record was 380 wins. Lloyd started talking about how he could pick a control point since the challenge was thrown to him. Lloyd began to say that they will get to the kingdom of Manjito, which is as far as 600 kilometers from this place. He began to say that it is thanks to human patience he can easily win. The sun was shining incredibly brightly outside. Lloyd and the leader walked to the starting point. They prepared for the start, while Lloyd thought that although many people consider humans to be weak, and in general it is hard to find an animal slower than a human among animals, but Lloyd was sure that humans are much stronger than they may think. The Minotaur fired a slingshot, signaling that the race was on. The head of the Minotaurs roared off at breakneck speed. In just a moment Lloyd was far behind. Lloyd remained at the starting point and did not move at all. Only after a few seconds did he begin to rise slowly, and then he began to move forward slowly, as if at a light jog, but so confidently. The Minotaurs shouted at the top of their voices. They thought that from that moment on the man had lost. Lloyd did not pay attention to the taunts. He only thought that the advantage of humans was that they could run long distances. At that time the head continued on his way, but his speed had dropped significantly. At that time Lloyd continued to move leisurely. The sound of breathing was heard outside, and a moment later Lloyd appeared on the horizon and continued his slow but steady movement. Lloyd thought that although he was not equal to the head in speed, the fact that he was human made him expend much less energy. The fact that Lloyd sweats and his body does not overheat, he thought, is the reason why people in the past were able to get food easily. The heart of coldness called Lloyd crazy. For all this time he had been talking to himself. Lloyd seemed a little tired, but he kept moving at his own pace. Lloyd saw the chapter and immediately realized that because of his speed he was quickly exhausted. Lloyd began to smile madly, because now he was sure of his victory. Suddenly his elation was replaced by incomprehension. The head looked perfectly normal. There wasn't even a drop of sweat on him. Lloyd thought that the head should have been tired long ago, but in fact he didn't seem tired at all. The head said that the long distance was really hard. He knew the weaknesses of his kind. The head said that the hero's plan wasn't bad, and then made a menacing look and said that the guy had completely underestimated the head's regenerative abilities. It seemed like Lloyd's brilliant, simply excellent and reliable plan had just been completely smashed. At that time, the head of the Minotaurs instantly began to move at breakneck speed, leaving Lloyd behind. Lloyd thought about how annoying this head was. Lloyd was well aware that now he had a huge problem. Lloyd tried to calm himself down and move at his own pace without thinking about the chapter. Suddenly Lloyd noticed something ahead of him. It turned out to be the head, who seemed to have already rested. Then he gestured goodbye, and at great speed started to move on. Lloyd continued on his way, thinking that this was the end, and now he had definitely lost. Lloyd began to think about how he could reverse this dire situation, but nothing came to mind, so he decided to keep moving at his own pace. This was a battle of endurance. The next day the sun was burning very hard. Lloyd seemed very tired. He had a lot of sweat on his face. He reached the northern border of the kingdom of Manjito, where the head of the Minotaurs was waiting for him. The head began to say that he had to wait a long time for the hero. He just wanted to look at the lost face of Lloyd. The head rushed out of the place at a great speed, while Lloyd hit the door of the wall, then turned around and continued running towards the village. Lloyd thought he should not have gone that way, and pondered how he could get what he needed. Lloyd thought that he should try to steal it, because he didn't really have to solve their problems. Suddenly an image of a Minotaur girl appeared to him. He thought about the girl's words. She wished they had different traditions. Lloyd made his mad face, then started running even more furiously. He ran with all his might. He seemed ready to fall at any moment, but he kept going. He kept thinking that he had to keep going. While the head was sitting on the rock, he was very tired and tried to rest a little. The hero did not stop to take a breath. He always continued his movement. Finally, he was able to overtake the head of the Minotaurs. But it was not for long. The man gathered his strength and continued his movement. The man was also very tired. But there was no comparison to how tired Lloyd was. It seemed that Lloyd had turned into a soulless creature that continued to move only on instinct. The head of the Minotauros was running across the field. He continued on his way, but suddenly his legs failed and he fell to the ground at a great speed. It seemed the man had reached his limit and needed to rest. He thought that it was not the same as before, because this time his stamina was very low. He thought that he was probably really exhausted this time. The man looked at the sky, and then he turned his gaze to the side and saw a frame from the past, where his daughter was with a guy who couldn't reach his potential. The girl was happy, though it was rare to see her like that. The man realized that the girl loved that guy, but there was no way he could ignore tradition just because she was his daughter. He wanted to go, but he didn't have time for that, because Lloyd was getting close, but he looked like he was in a bad way. The head began to shout with all his might from anger, then began to run their last strength, that on the account of the hero, he has long ago used up all his stamina, and continued to move only on the strength of his will and thirst for victory. At that time, the spectators were waiting for the moment of return of Lloyd and their head. Suddenly, the boy pointed towards the road and said that he saw something. Suddenly, the girl's face was astonished, and her lover was no less surprised. It was hard to imagine such a picture, but it was real. The head was not going to give in, and Lloyd, who had long since gone beyond his limits, was not going to give up either. Xavier watched silently. The head was just a little ahead, which was enough to win, because the finish line was very close. At that time, Xavier noticed that the hero had no mana left at all. But he continued to believe in Lloyd, because he always came out of dangerous situations victorious. The system asked Lloyd if he wanted to use the Energizer skill, but Lloyd continued to believe only that he had to keep moving. The system tried to get through to the guy, but he kept moving without listening to it. Xavier seemed amazed at what he was seeing. Lloyd was literally a few centimeters behind the head. They were doing their best together. Lloyd thought he was really going to die, and couldn't understand why the man could still move. Suddenly, the man's hooves began to shake and he fell to the ground, leaving a cloud of dust behind him, while Lloyd continued to run and managed to overtake the chapter, after which the man instantly jumped up from his seat and was ahead again. Lloyd prayed that the head would fall, for at this rate he would lose, and all efforts would be in vain. The head was just as incredibly eager to win this confrontation. Lloyd's foot was about to touch the ground, but suddenly a terrible feeling came over him. He felt as if he were underwater. His body became incredibly heavy, and Lloyd himself seemed to be suffocating in the thick of the water. As the head continued his movement, Lloyd was getting further and further behind. It seemed that this was the moment when the guy reached his true limit. The hero remembered how his nose had bled in the past, and how the guy had made a joke about Lloyd not only having no money but also no stamina, and then started wiping the hero's nose. Lloyd apologized, because he was being served meat and his nose was bleeding. The boy looked at the hero with incomprehension. He thought that the hero was not balanced at all. He said that the hero had a brilliant mind and strong willpower, but he could not understand why the hero seemed so depressed every day. He felt as if the hero came from another world and couldn't adjust. He said that in anime this was common, while the hero said that he had been quiet since childhood. The guy only looked at the hero with suspicion. The boy confessed that he couldn't buy meat for the hero now because his parents had been summoned to court for fraud, and they would definitely go to jail. He knew that soon he would lose all his money. He said he was a natural loser, just like his parents. The guy assumed that the hero didn't need to see him now because he had no money at all, while the hero said he only had one friend, and it was this guy. The guy said that friends should give and receive something, but he couldn't understand what Lloyd could learn from him. He also said that the hero was actually very tough. He said that no matter what terrible conditions the hero was in, he kept going, and imagined that if he had been in similar conditions, he would have given up at the beginning of the journey. He asked how to become as strong as the hero. He said that he is not strong at all. He does the same thing, namely teach and work, every day. The guy laughed and then made a promise to himself to become like the protagonist. He decided to try to break through, so to speak, to open a second breath. Lloyd started screaming with all his might. Xavier was amazed at what he was seeing. Lloyd kept going, even though his body should have given up long ago. He took one step at a time while Xavier marveled at the boundless fortitude Lloyd was showing right now. Xavier saw that for the first time the hero was not relying on his mysterious abilities, but was pushing the limit with his own efforts. Now Xavier was very curious to know what kind of life this monster had lived in the other world, since he had such a strong will. The girl stopped her breath. It was a very exciting moment, but not only for her, but also for almost all the villagers, because they saw an incredible picture that took their breath away. Lloyd's mind seemed to be foggy, but he kept moving forward like a madman. Suddenly his eyes began to close and darkness followed. The first thing he saw when he opened his eyes was Xavier, with the rays of the sun shining on him. The hero was lying down. His body was in a terrible state, but the first thing he asked was if he could win. Xavier closed his eyes, then looked in the direction where just a few meters away from the hero lay the head of the village, and confessed that Lloyd was able to win. Xavier helped the boy up. After Lloyd was able to get up, he heard the voice of the head of the village, who began to shout enthusiastically that their village would finally be able to enter a whole new era. All the villagers were shouting in delight. It seemed that there was no trace of the past discontent left. Lloyd was proud. He began to claim that everything had gone strictly according to plan, but Xavier wasn't so sure. Xavier didn't understand why Lloyd didn't use his powers. He could have one so easily. Lloyd didn't know what to say to that question, while the Minotaur cheered and showed everyone his muscles. Lloyd answered that seeing the man running, he could not use his power because it would not be fair. The system said that Lloyd was using his mana and heart, but he thought that passive skills didn't count. Xavier sighed. At that time, Lloyd looked in his direction with disbelief, and Xavier said it was time for them to start building. He also called Lloyd his master and promised to do everything in his power to achieve his goal. Lloyd didn't understand why he had suddenly become a young lord. Xavier explained that Lloyd was now worthy of being addressed that way. Xavier was now determined, ready to give his life to protect Lloyd. Meanwhile, in the tent, the hero began to talk about how the construction would take about a year. He also said that he came from another world, and he was also going to stop time in order to finish the work as soon as possible. He also said that it would be hard for everyone to leave this meadow after he used the ability. Xavier was amazed that the hero had not only told about stopping time, but also revealed his identity to everyone. The head shouted that there was nothing wrong with it, which made Xavier freak out at the strangeness of these guys. Lloyd and Xavier stood on a small hill like the good old days, looking out over the empty meadow. Lloyd opened a skill window and then used a time freeze that took 3,000 points. Lloyd began to make a face. Then with all his might he pressed the button to start the process. Winter's heart began to emit a faint light that grew brighter and brighter with each passing second. Lloyd's body began to shake, and he began to make very strange noises as the convulsions continued, and nothing seemed to be happening at all. At that time, the area on which the hero applied the skill remained unchanged, but a moment later there was a dome. The guys were shocked that such a great power could look so boring and uninteresting. Lloyd decided to go and check out the area, whereupon he saw a beast that froze in an attempt to catch a butterfly. Lloyd was disappointed that it wasn't spectacular at all, but at least it worked, so that was a plus. Now Lloyd was going to start building. Xavier was hitting the ground furiously. It looked like he was going to destroy the world, but in reality he was just doing the first stage of construction, which was leveling the ground. Xavier then began to prepare the ground while Lloyd relaxed on the recliner. After that, Xavier began the third phase and began tamping the ground fiercely. Xavier's patience ran out, and he asked Lloyd why he was doing absolutely all the robot work while the hero himself was resting. Lloyd began to shout at his subordinate. He said that since Xavier recognized him as a young master, he must obey the demands that are made of him. Xavier's rage was boundless. He seemed to want to strangle the asshole. Lloyd summoned one of his pets to help with the tamping of the earth. Bell began to produce rebar and concrete. Lloyd was thinking about step 6, which was to lay the rebar. Lloyd imagined what this would look like, but he also thought that it would be difficult to do it all alone, so he called the centaurs, who proved to be completely useless in this endeavor. Lloyd realized that nothing would be accomplished at this rate, while Xavier worked day after day without rest. They started the pouring of the concrete, and then immediately began to take care of it. After that came step 9, and they began to set the sand. Lloyd started yelling behind Xavier's back that there was one last step left, namely the grand finale. Lloyd looked at the beautiful structure that had been created. Lloyd rejoiced that the massive 7-month construction project had come to an end. Lloyd bragged to Xavier and asked him to recognize Lloyd's feat, for he had done it in only 7 months. Xavier was incredibly angry, and it seemed he was about to take Lloyd by the head and tear him apart. But in the end, he was able to restrain himself and said only that he agreed, then hurried away from Lloyd. The system informed the hero that Xavier was now feeling a great deal of anger towards Lloyd, but he seemed to be enjoying it, grinning his teeth. There was a great shouting sound near the arena. It turned out to be the head, who started showing the residents their new stadium for the competition. The head started to say that now you can't run in the city, only here in this arena. He also added that even though there are residents who don't like it, it doesn't matter, because it's the head's decision. The head announced that there would be a tournament for the heart of his favorite daughter, and although she tried to object, her father did not listen to her. Participant number 1 was incredibly happy, as he would finally be able to get the girl. But contestant number 2 was the girl's lover, who also wanted to win. The man tried to hurt the guy. He said with the most formidable look that no amount of training would help the guy to win. He also said that last time he did not run at full speed, and this time he would not leave a chance for the boy. The kid was silent, listening to all that diarrhea coming out of his mouth. Lloyd told the guys to stop, then pulled out a spatula that would signal the start of the contest. They got ready to run. The girl was watching the guys carefully, because her fate depended on it, and the head was also watching carefully, because only then it would be clear whether his daughter would be happy or not. Lloyd announced the beginning of the race, and then the young man ran so fast that he tore the clothes not only of his opponent, but also of Lloyd, who was standing next to him. All the spectators felt a strong gust of wind, and were incredibly shocked. They didn't understand what happened and saw that the guy crossed the finish line in an instant, and instantly became the winner of the competition. The guy said that now he had an urgent matter, because that's why he decided to finish quickly. The man was just shocked at what he saw. At that time, the guy jumped to his beloved, and Lloyd heard the guy asking the girl to marry him. She started shaking and crying. She seemed incredibly excited. She hugged the lad and told him he could have done it much sooner. The father was also very happy for his daughter, because she could finally be happy. She shouted at the top of her voice that this incredible guy was now hers. The couple looked at Lloyd with grateful eyes, while the half-naked Lloyd was also happy that there were at least 2 more happy people in the world. It was late at night. The atmosphere inside one of the tents was bad. The man confessed that there was no other way to solve their problem. He suggested divorce. The girl thought it was the right decision, because she also did not know any other way to solve the issue. At that time in the arena began to announce the last match for today. It turned out to be the same couple. The man decided to fight for the right to be in a relationship with the girl again. The signal to start the match sounded. Lloyd couldn't understand what was wrong with the name of the match. At that time, the girl started talking about how popular this kind of thing was among the tribe. It turned out to be a popular practice for couples to divorce and have a match to get back together. Lloyd was shocked at what he had just heard. The girl interrupted her story as she remembered a small thing. She held out a map and said it was the location of an item the guy needed. Lloyd instantly snatched the map from the girl's hands and bragged that he had promised he could. Lloyd's face changed as the girl thanked him for the changes he had brought to their settlement. Lloyd said he didn't need thanks, because he had done what he had to do. The system congratulated the hero for leaving a mark in the history of the centaurs and sent him 100 points. At the time, Xavier looked at Lloyd and seemed to think, He thought that although a hero always does things for himself, the result ends up benefiting all the people around him. Xavier thought that Lloyd was different from the heroes of fairy tales. As he walked away, Xavier continued to think that Lloyd was the main hero of this world to him. Suddenly, Xavier's body began to distort. Suddenly, Lloyd turned his head back with a look of fear on his face, and he didn't see Xavier. He was gone. Lloyd was horrified, but suddenly he heard his friend's voice, and Xavier was standing there, unable to understand what had just happened to Lloyd. Lloyd tried to explain that Xavier had just disappeared for a moment, but he couldn't understand his master at all. Lloyd finally decided not to explain anything further. He assumed that he was just imagining it because he was tired, and then Lloyd froze. He thought it was time to stop the time freeze, and then everything went back to normal. The hero and Xavier just stood there looking at the distance. Lloyd was very angry at how easily it happened. It was not cool at all. Suddenly, the hero's heart began to ice over. Lloyd's face twisted and he sat down from the terrible pain he felt in his chest. Lloyd asked what the hell had just happened. His heart explained that it was the cold air that had gone out to freeze time, and it had just come back in. Lloyd started a discussion with the heart. He didn't think it was normal. In a fit of emotion, he told the heart to fuck off, but it told him that if it left, Lloyd would inevitably die. Lloyd fell into thought, while the heart advised him to ask whoever was coming. Suddenly, Xavier told the hero that someone was approaching them. Xavier also said that it was likely to be an enemy that even he couldn't handle. It seemed that there was nothing above, and he thought of everything. But just a moment later, a terrifying creature appeared in the sky, which at a great speed was moving towards the guys. Xavier tried to cover Lloyd, though he was incredibly scared himself. A huge ice dragon appeared in front of them, its mere presence frightening. Lloyd immediately realized that this was the dragon that had created the winter bastard in his heart. The dragon asked if the hero was the man who had misused the power of his heart and frozen the time of the world. The dragon was incredibly angry and said that Lloyd should bring him back. Lloyd made as innocent a face as possible and tried to make a fool of himself, which scared Xavier incredibly badly. The dragon looked at the guy in silence. Even his very heart sank at this atmosphere. The dragon asked if it wasn't really the guy's fault, and Lloyd said that the dragon seemed to be mistaken. So Lloyd wished the dragon good luck in finding the bastard, and then began to walk away. Lloyd and Xavier realized that if the hero's stupidest deception didn't work, they would be dead in a second. Suddenly, the dragon turned to the couple, then made it clear that he was not to be fooled. Lloyd and Xavier began to bow, and the hero asked what the dragon was looking for. He was looking for the heart of winter, and Lloyd pretended that he had heard wrong. Lloyd was also angry that his brilliant plan didn't work. At the time, Xavier couldn't even imagine how the hero could have hoped for such a stupid and obvious plan. Dragon started yelling about how he gave the artifact to the founder of the Manjito Kingdom, and yet Lloyd doesn't even look like an extension of the royal lineage. Dragon assumed that Lloyd had simply stolen the artifact, but Lloyd began to say that although he was not related by blood to the royal family, he was the groom of a member of the cow family. The dragon began to wonder whose boyfriend the groom was. Lloyd began to say that he is the groom of the Queen of Majito. Dragon wondered if he should check those words now. Lloyd, with a confident look, said let him check. Then the dragon instantly took off and headed towards the kingdom. The guys remained on the ground. Lloyd started to rise slowly, and then realized that this time he was going to die. At that time, the girl brought the dragon over and didn't understand his question. While the dragon once again asked if the girl was really married to Lloyd, the man who had absorbed the artifact. The queen was shocked by such a question and simply froze. The myth said that it was this dragon that helped create the kingdom of Manjito. The girl just now saw that very legendary dragon in front of her. The girl thought about the purpose of the visit of such a powerful being. The dragon asked if it was true that she was Lloyd's wife. The girl didn't even look up. The question seemed to have no emotion. She asked again, and then heard the same question, which finally snapped her out of her calm state, and to put it mildly, she freaked out. The dragon began to shout that Lloyd had lied to him, as the girl's reaction screamed it. The queen began to guess what might have happened. The girl instantly realized what was happening. Then she confessed that they had a secret brother, and that's why she was surprised. Dragon didn't understand why their marriage was secret, and the girl confessed that she was actually embarrassed. The dragon didn't understand what there was to be ashamed of, and the girl began to say that when she saw her husband Lloyd, she became shy and self-conscious, and she was afraid that others would call her a shy queen when they saw her. Listening to this, the dragon couldn't believe that these words could sound so convincing. The girl said that she had given the heart of winter to her husband, and added that it had not been stolen. The dragon fell silent, then said that he believed the girl, and instantly disappeared, leaving the queen standing alone on the balcony. The girl continued to stand, and could only hear the sounds of the doors moving because of the wind. The veins on her forehead were starting to show, for she was very angry. She was definitely going to take revenge on Lloyd for this situation. At that time, Lloyd and Xavier had already accepted their deaths. A great dragon instantly appeared right in front of them. At that time, Lloyd was looking at this terrifying creature with dead eyes. The dragon also looked into Lloyd's eyes, then said it was true. At that time, Lloyd was incredibly happy that he managed to survive. He was also very grateful to the queen who made it possible. The dragon magnanimously decided since the man hadn't stolen the heart, now he was going to pull it out quickly and without pain. All of Lloyd's hope was dashed to smithereens. The dragon began to say that Lloyd was too dangerous to the world. That was the reason the dragon was going to take the heart. The heart began to leave Lloyd's body, and he felt a terrible pain. Xavier instantly reached for his sword. Lloyd ordered Xavier to stop and shouted to the dragon whether he would pity the guy if Lloyd died. Suddenly, his heart stopped and then went back up, causing Lloyd to fall to the ground. The dragon asked to explain the hero's words. Lloyd was glad that the dragon would at least listen to him. Lloyd confessed that he was a member of the Dragon King's Club. The dragon couldn't believe that the man had become a member of the Dragon King's Club, so Lloyd told the dragon to check. The dragon began to stare at the man. Then he saw that the very underdog Dragon King recognized him. Lloyd thought about the fact that based on what the dragon said, he was on par with the Dragon King, and if Xavier attacked, he would die. Lloyd said that if the dragon killed him, the Dragon King would be angry. The dragon was angry that the man was threatening him, then said he could tolerate the Dragon King since it was worth the order of the world. Lloyd said he wasn't going to threaten. He had already pretty much accepted his fate. Lloyd said he didn't want anyone to get hurt because of him, and offered the dragon a deal. The dragon was interested and told Lloyd to speak his offer. Lloyd offered to make a bet, and if he won, he could live. Lloyd said that he would probably lose, but added that if the dragon killed the hero after the outcome of the bet, there would be no problem. Lloyd offered some interesting terms, namely if he could make the dragon nauseous with a blow, then he would win. Lloyd also always tried to convey the idea that such a thing was not even possible. Lloyd also added the words that after death he would be given the title of the man who struck the legendary dragon. The dragon pondered this offer while Lloyd pleaded with him tearfully. The dragon decided to accept it because it would be easier for him, because Lloyd had not failed in anything. Lloyd thanked the dragon for coming down and then asked for one last wish. Lloyd wanted to go somewhere else. Xavier didn't understand what Lloyd was thinking, because that was impossible. Lloyd pretended to cry, while Xavier assumed that Lloyd only wanted to stop the dragon and run away. They reached a body of water. The dragon got ready to strike, while Lloyd went completely pink, though it only looked that way from one side. He actually had a crazy smile on his face. The dragon began to shake from this hellish expression. Then Lloyd went straight for the dragon, swung with all his might, then activated his solar plexus shot skill and hit the dragon. But the blow seemed incredibly weak. The dragon praised Lloyd for trying, but suddenly it started burping with all its might. It turned out the effect of the skill was that any creature in the water would burp after one hit. Lloyd rejoiced as he had now easily outsmarted and defeated the legendary dragon. In the past, the dragon was having a great time alone, but suddenly time froze, and then the dragon stayed in that state the whole time. He couldn't understand what kind of creature was able to stop the time of the whole world. He began to search for the creature that created it all. Then he realized that it was a man who did it all. He couldn't understand what kind of a man it was that could stop time. The dragon thought it was very dangerous. That was the reason why as time went on, the dragon found himself in this situation. He threw up after being hit in the solar plexus by a man. Lloyd started to play dumb again and pretended not to understand how he had won the argument. The dragon didn't even know what to say. Suddenly his body began to glow very brightly, and then he took human form. He couldn't understand how some human could make his great dragon vomit. Lloyd continued to play dumb and pretended he didn't understand at all. Lloyd asked if he would live. He had won the argument after all. The dragon said he could not retract his words. Lloyd finally breathed a sigh of relief, for he had been so worried. The dragon warned that if the hero did something like that again, he would not live. Lloyd said it would never happen again. The dragon was shocked by Lloyd's cunning and abilities. He thought that letting such a man go would be a mistake. The dragon realized that if Lloyd was an evil man, his son would definitely not be accepted into the Dragon Club. Lloyd realized that the Dragon King was the dragon's son. The dragon confirmed the hero's guess and said that the Dragon King was his son. Lloyd's face was horrified. The dragon couldn't understand what was going on. At that time, Lloyd started to approach and grabbed the dragon's hand and cried, saying that the dragon was probably having a hard time. The dragon asked Lloyd to let go, as it was the right thing to do. Lloyd felt sorry for the dragon and rubbed his vomit-stained hands on the dragon. Tears appeared on the dragon's cheeks. He didn't understand why this was happening while Lloyd told the dragon to cry. Lloyd could feel the dragon's great pain, and he also said that the dragon had done well for such a hard time. The dragon was completely moved and continued to cry. He hugged the hero, as in romantic movies, and then confessed that he had never heard such words, as well as he said that he tried very hard to bring up a normal dragon from the king. The dragon cried that all his efforts were pointless. He cried because no one cared about him. They just lived their lives. At that time, Xavier had finally lost his mind with such bullshit. Lloyd made a serious face and then said they couldn't do that. Lloyd said that they couldn't ignore such an adorable companion as the dragon. The dragon finally burst into tears and started crying with all his might. Lloyd just hugged the poor dragon and tried to support him. Lloyd instantly changed his face. His plan to change his opinion of himself was instantly executed, and the old dragon who thought Lloyd was dangerous died at that moment. Xavier watched this inadequate picture. He couldn't understand how to perceive Lloyd. After all, he brings good to people, but his motives can be evil. He was stuck in his thoughts. A little while later, the sky was beautifully blue. All three men were lying on the ground looking at the sky, and the dragon noticed that he was ashamed of crying in the man's arms. Lloyd reassured the dragon by saying that no matter who he was, everyone's feelings were equal. The dragon stared at the man and then asked Lloyd's name, and he confirmed that it was his name. The dragon said that Lloyd would soon die. He also said that because of the heart of winter that was slowly getting colder, Lloyd would soon leave this world. The heart inside the hero didn't want him to die, but Lloyd said that there was no way he could die now, because he had important work to do. The dragon said that the problem could be solved if Lloyd absorbed the pupils of summer, which contained the power of fire. Lloyd realized that it was a relic of Mangetto, and that he would have to go into debt to the queen again. In a shaky voice, he asked how much time he had before he died. The dragon said the minimum was 5 years, but the maximum was 10. Lloyd's face changed instantly, because that would be enough time for him to solve his problems. The dragon noticed Lloyd's incredible strength of spirit and assumed that it was seen by his son and the heart of winter. The dragon asked what the case was. Lloyd explained that it was a long story, but the dragon wanted to hear it. The dragon also said that if it wasn't too hard, he would help Lloyd. So Lloyd began to tell the long story. The dragon said that he had 2 of the necessary artifacts, which made the hero's face hopeful. He instantly started begging the dragon to give the artifacts. The dragon gave Lloyd the go-ahead to take the artifacts. Lloyd was incredibly happy. He was worried that he would not be able to find all the artifacts. There are 5 of them, and now he got 2 more artifacts so easily. Lloyd was left to find the last artifact. The dragon said that Verge had this artifact. The dragon said that this artifact was sent to another dimension. Lloyd was incredibly angry, as now he had no idea where to find it. Suddenly, the dragon remembered something and said that the artifact Lloyd wanted to find was in Seoul. A little while later, in a mountain peak, which is on one side of the southern plains, the hero was able to get the artifacts he needed, after which he was awarded 2,200 points, and he went to the ocean, where he successfully asked out the necessary materials in the water. Also, the hero received 2 artifacts from the dragon, for which he also 5,000 points, and in the end, in the presence of the hero, were as much as 8,955 points. The dragon asked if it was necessary to send these artifacts as well as those to the kingdom of mermaids, but the hero refused. Lloyd thanked the dragon for such great help, and he confessed that it was not difficult for him at all. Lloyd said he would not bother the dragon again, and simply asked him to watch his actions from now on. The dragon warned that to get the last artifact Lloyd would need the help of the Dragon King, and he was not easy to convince. Lloyd made a neutral face, and then said with a frantic look that it was no problem for him. The dragon got nervous. He thought Lloyd was a very scary man, because he had gotten everything he wanted from him. Lloyd began to shout to the dragon to come to him, and then the dragon went to his favorite father. The dragon successfully arrived. The dragon was amazed that the man was able to summon the Bone Man. He thought that if Lloyd wanted to, he could easily destroy the whole world, but he would not do it. The dragon began to say that the phenomenon Lloyd was facing was incredibly complex, but also added words of encouragement. He believed that Lloyd was bound to get what he wanted. Lloyd smiled. Such words seemed pleasant to him. After that, he and Xavier flew home on the dragon. Xavier wondered if the dragon would be willing to move the hero, as he was incredibly lazy, but Lloyd already knew what he would do to achieve his goal. Xavier seemed to ponder, then asked if Seoul was the protagonist's hometown. Lloyd looked at Xavier carefully, then asked why Xavier thought so, and Xavier confessed that he had seen the change in Lloyd's face as soon as Seoul was mentioned. Lloyd's face wasn't the same as it had always been, and he said that his only home was Frontera. He actually misses it a lot. He was worried about his friends and residents. At that time, the city itself had beautiful and tall buildings. Suddenly, a soldier's foot stepped on the ground. It turned out that there was a whole bunch of them. The squad leader said that this was the place where there was a lot of gold and silver. It turned out that it was an old prince, who is now a thief, and thinks that by capturing this village, he can create his kingdom. The woeful prince ordered the men to begin the assault, and then asked them to cut off the lord's head. The warriors set out to attack the town with the goal of destroying everything to the ground. But halfway through their journey, they came across goblins who were looking at the incomprehensible humans invading their lands. The knights were frightened by the sudden appearance of the orcs and began to run for their lives. The woeful prince could not understand what the orcs were doing here and why they were walking around freely. The woe prince said to go to the city through the forest, where they successfully met the elven women, who were just preparing for a meal. The knights were dumbfounded, while one of the elven women looked at the knights with disdain. It turned out one of them had killed a flower that was growing on the ground. She grabbed her bow and began to glare menacingly at her opponents. As a result, terrible screams were heard from the forest. It seemed as if a huge number of people were being tortured. Eventually, the knights returned again with a total defeat, and reported that the elves in the forest roasted very appetizing meat. The Prince of Woe was furious, and ordered the knights to go all out. They began their movement, a real huge number of bandits. The orc reported to the man that a group of thieves were moving towards them. The man didn't seem nervous about it at all. He was thinking that these thieves would make excellent guinea pigs for testing new weapons. Eventually, they used one salvo of the new weapon, and the missile flew right over the heads of the bandits, and upon impact caused a huge explosion that instantly instilled a terrible fear in the hearts of these bandits. The man complained that the shell flew over, but they were glad that this time it was better than last time. The grief-stricken prince threatened to kill everyone. His loyal servant also stayed with him. The people began to ask the dragon to send these idiots home, and quickly. The dragon instantly started to fulfill the request, then began to spew flames very effectively, chasing these people away. A little while later, a man covered in soot was walking with a cane, repeating the words that he was a great prince and that he would surely destroy this village. But suddenly he saw a huge dragon above his head, after which the light of hope was always extinguished in his eyes. The villagers were shocked by the sudden appearance of the dragon. Lloyd started to rise to his feet, then with his mad face asked what that idiot prince had just said. As soon as the people saw that it was Lloyd, the surprise fell off their faces. This was something they were already used to, while the grief-stricken prince fainted from fright and shattered psyche. Later, Lloyd's territory was called the territory of the demon god. Lloyd climbed down from the dragon and went to the Dragon King to open the door to Seoul, while the king himself slept carefree and had no idea that he would soon have to exert himself. A little while later, the day came The skeletons were moving around inside the room. They were playing a tune. They unceremoniously invaded the king's chambers and started playing as loud as possible. One of the skeletons was hitting the strings with all his might. The others were doing their best to make the sound as loud as possible. At that time, it had no effect on the king, and he continued to sleep sweetly. The violinist also tried his best to wake up the dragon. The people around could not stand it, as the sound went far beyond this room. The dragon finally opened his eyes, and the first thing he said upon awakening was that it was very noisy, after which he directed his evil gaze towards the tendrils and instantly sizzled them with a volley from his eyes. One of the bones fell on the leg of the protagonist. Lloyd continued to move into the room, after which he, with a mad look, took a lungful of air that even Xavier was afraid of the consequences and used magic. Then from the mouth of Lloyd began to come out such a hellish scream that this time the people outside almost deafened by this horror. Even magic didn't completely save the Xavier from the psychic attack. The dragon instantly woke up and the emotion of horror was frozen on his face. Even after a few seconds he couldn't move away and his face remained with the same emotion. Lloyd finally stopped his infernal chanting and then inquired as to how the Dragon King was doing. The king confessed that he had been doing fine up to that point, but as soon as the hero's mouth made those awful sounds, he felt sick. Lloyd asked if the dragon liked the sound of the alarm clock, and suddenly the dragon's mood changed. He remembered that he had not contacted his child for months, and because of that he was in a deep anger. It seemed that now Lloyd's life was about to end. Lloyd reminded him that he had been waking the Dragon King steadily and regularly as he had promised, but the fact that he hadn't contacted the girl was his problem. Lloyd also said that it was the Dragon King's own concern, not his. The dragon was completely broken, for he had let the girl down again. Lloyd began to speak, after which hope appeared in the dragon's eyes. Lloyd began to talk, or rather to make up a story about the Dragon King, who was occupied by a villain from another world, who was able to move between worlds. Lloyd said that as a Dragon King he couldn't leave things as they were, and pursued the villain day and night, and eventually managed to catch him. Lloyd pointed to himself with a mad look, and then said that he was the one who should be the villain. The Dragon King didn't react at first, then a bright smile appeared on his face. He thought that with such a story, the girl would praise him, while the hero said that the Dragon King should restrain him and drag him to the queen. Lloyd promised to play the villain as believably as possible. Xavier thought about the fact that Lloyd didn't really need to play a villain, because he looked like one. Lloyd was in a great mood. He seemed to be waiting for something. The Dragon King guessed that he needed something, and immediately asked Lloyd what he wanted. Lloyd said that he needed to find an artifact in Seoul. The dragon had no idea what kind of artifact he was talking about. The king remembered that it was the material for the Pearl of Truth, but Lloyd held a grudge that the dragon knew about it but didn't tell him. The dragon said he would send Lloyd, but not to the exact location. He started reaching for his shirt. Turns out it was an artifact dog that can find anything. The dragon began to pull out a magic hammer, then began to spin it and say the name of the city. Lloyd was already anticipating that something incredible was about to happen, but a moment later the dragon just threw the hammer to the ground. Suddenly strange markings appeared on the ground. Lloyd was completely disappointed. Xavier was surprised that his master was still not used to such things. Lloyd and Xavier stood in the middle of this circle. Then their feet began to glow. Every second they disappeared more and more. The dragon also said that in order to return they had to get on the same wheel in another world. The dragon suggested that Lloyd's homeland was Seoul. The dragon warned Lloyd that he should not see himself, because it could be disastrous. The boys finally disappeared, and then a portal appeared in a back alley in Seoul. Xavier, along with Lloyd, began to appear from the portal. They were standing in an alleyway, and Xavier thought about the fact that they were in Lloyd's hometown. He was worried that the hero might want to stay there and not want to go back. Xavier thought that even if he had to use force, he would bring Lloyd back. Suddenly Xavier noticed a very strange thing, namely that all the mana in his body had suddenly disappeared, because it didn't exist in this world. Xavier looked towards Lloyd, who said that they had to move out. Xavier was worried about losing his mana, because if there was a dangerous situation he wouldn't be able to protect Lloyd. Suddenly a bright light hit the servant's face. He saw strange sights in front of him, and the air reminded him of the air in hell. Lloyd decided to go out and buy clothes. Because they stood out, Xavier was worried that they would be in danger without mana. But Lloyd explained that there was no such thing. Xavier didn't seem to understand the world at all, while Lloyd didn't show any emotion. In fact, he was incredibly worried. Kiaura was the last ingredient to restore the pearl. It was a mysterious substance that changed depending on where it was located. Lloyd knew that this artifact had changed somewhere here in Seoul. Lloyd tried to pull the heavy thing. He was glad he was able to get the stuff. Even though it stunk, it wouldn't stand out now. Xavier was worried about the main character. He didn't look so good before. Lloyd clutched at his heart. It seemed like something was starting to happen. Xavier started to worry about the guy. Suddenly some strange man showed up and started yelling for the guys to put what they had stolen back as it was stealing. Lloyd was pissed at Xavier since he was supposed to be on guard. All he had to do was apologize to Lloyd. Lloyd started talking about them being a collection company, but the policeman didn't believe it because the guys looked very suspicious and strange. Lloyd began to take something shiny out of his jacket and hinted to the policeman as much as possible about a bribe by taking out shiny pieces of gold. Lloyd suggested that the policeman use the money to buy himself some ice cream and perhaps some tea. The policeman saw the incredible temptation in front of him, but his hand began to lift the handcuffs, whereupon he said that Lloyd would tell everything to the police station. Lloyd was shocked that his trick didn't work at all. Then he threw the bars of gold, which worked on the policeman, whereupon he and Xavier began to run away at breakneck speed. Lloyd was angry that his face didn't look good in this world either. Xavier didn't understand why the guy was worried about that. At that time, the policeman started tasting the gold frantically. The policeman started to shake with anger. Since he fell for a couple pieces of gold so easily, he promised himself to catch that ugly cosplayer and the foreigner, and put them away for at least 10 years. Suddenly, the policeman recognized the hero from a slight description, namely that the guy was an ugly cosplayer. Literally, every cop recognized Lloyd from the description of an ugly cosplayer. Finally, Lloyd and Xavier were able to get away and take a break. Xavier didn't understand why they hadn't bought the clothes for gold in the first place, so Lloyd explained that it wasn't that simple. Lloyd started to say that they should go back to the portal and gather some things. But suddenly Lloyd started to make strange noises, and then his appearance became horrible. It seemed that he was not a man but a walking corpse. Xavier didn't understand why Lloyd looked so horrible, but the hero wasn't going to confess and just said that it was time for them to change. Xavier suspected something, but he couldn't ask directly. As night fell outside, Lloyd used the artifact, and he and Xavier, in their new clothes, went to the place the dog had pointed to. They saw a huge building that emitted a lot of light. Suddenly voices were heard behind them. A man said he couldn't see the cosplayer, but there was some guy with a scary back standing there. The hero, along with Xavier, instantly rushed in the right direction. Lloyd realized that they couldn't get to the place by the usual route and would have to take the mountain path. Xavier thought about the fact that they couldn't hide the ugliness of the protagonist, which naturally made Lloyd angry. It was night outside, but Seoul was sewing under artificial light. Lloyd was incredibly tired. There seemed to be something wrong with his body. Xavier offered to rest, but the protagonist refused. He said that he could do it because he was Lloyd. Suddenly, the hero fell on one knee, then on the curd and began to breathe very hard. Lloyd apologized for stopping pretending. He was just incredibly tired. Xavier asked how Lloyd's middle name was. Lloyd asked if he looked miserable. Xavier said he didn't look miserable, but he noticed right away that Lloyd wasn't feeling well right after they came into this world. Lloyd said he was fine. He said that when he lived in this world, he always said that although the world was scary and unfamiliar, he was fine as long as his mother and father were around. Turns out his parents died years ago of a heart condition, and it's been a pain that Lloyd can't get used to ever since. Lloyd started talking about how he thought he could accomplish literally anything. He said that he was really nothing. That's just how he was. Xavier seethed that the hero was blaming himself while he lived in this world. Xavier assumed that Lloyd was sitting just like he was now and blaming himself for everything in the world. Lloyd was silent for a short period of time, after which he said he wanted to do it, but in the end he couldn't. He was all alone in the world early on. His parents had been deceived. He couldn't stop because his parents were incredible people, and he did everything he could to be like them. He was doing everything he could to prove to his parents that they were doing the right thing. Xavier asked who had given Lloyd that responsibility. He said he had taken it upon himself. It was all that filled his emptiness. Xavier was silent for a while with a sad face, then said that Lloyd was worried for no reason. Xavier thought Lloyd was a great man, no matter if he was in Seoul or in another world. Xavier said that it didn't matter if Lloyd was scaring others or crying sadly. After all, Lloyd was a man who took responsibility. Lloyd stopped crying and began wiping away his tears. He turned to Xavier and then said that this time he would walk ahead. A genuine smile appeared on Xavier's face as his favorite lord had returned. Guys, if you like this video, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, put a like, and if possible I want to ask you to watch my other videos. I try very hard on each of them. Thank you all for watching. Good luck. Goodbye.